What is happening? J Game Dude here, and let's talk about how the Elden Ring DLC Shadow of the Erd Tree is really easy. And I say that in an absolutely facetious manner because there's always been this sort of discussion around the difficulty of games. And FromSoft's franchise of Soulsborne titles, so whether it be Dark Souls, Demon Souls, the Dark Souls sequels 2, 3, Sekiro, Elden Ring, there's always been this sort of discussion about making the games more accessible to a wider audience, because there is this fervor for these types of games that teach you how to play by punishing you. You step through a door too quickly and boom, a trap hits you and you die. You walk downstairs way too quickly and then there's some random enemy that one-shots you immediately that you just couldn't see because he was in your sort of blind spot, so to speak, as you're walking down the stairs. Like, there are these sorts of things that happen that just make you want to become more careful about your surroundings, using things like Titanite shards to upgrade your weapons and things along those lines, and so on and so forth. And the general online discourse has been from the community, you just have to get good, and it takes time to get good, and if you can't get good, you're not a real gamer, and things along those lines. Calling those sorts of games, and I think Cuphead might be a very good example of this, the whole idea of video game reviewer difficulty, where there was that time in which a video game review couldn't actually get past the tutorial for Cuphead, which is why I kind of brought that up as a momentary lapse of, like, clearly video game journalists aren't really good enough to be able to play games, so that's where the whole idea of video game journalism difficulty comes in, whereby it's so easy that any brain dead moron could actually get through any part of it. But now the shoe is on the other foot. We're currently looking at the periscope from the opposite direction, rather. Because now it's the Soulsborne crowd that is saying that the game is in fact too difficult. And it's funny and interesting to think about that, so let's actually kind of take a step back and see where all of this is actually coming from. And the majority of it is actually coming from the Steam reviews. I'm also just using this Game Rant article as kind of like a background, but for the most part, it's not really... There isn't much in the way of actual content from this particular author that I'm talking about, but rather just the general idea of what the discourse has kind of been. But effectively, actually, you know what, let's use this point here. Elden Ring Shadow of the Erd Tree has received mixed reviews on Steam, largely due to its challenging difficulty. Now, even though it's not actually mentioned here, most of those mixed reviews are actually coming from, or rather most of those negative reviews regarding the difficulty are actually coming from the Chinese player base, because effectively what's happened is that there are a lot of guides to Elden Ring and its DLC and things like that. However, because the Chinese user base is so much smaller, because they have to use a VPN to connect to Steam, you know, they actually are not able to get their, guides that are in their language and be able to actually assist those Chinese players. And so a majority of them are actually about difficulty, not being able to kind of understand where to go, what to do, and things along those lines. And it's also worth mentioning that the Chinese audience actually use the review system on Steam as more of a forum to either display their distaste, their displeasure, or if they enjoyed something, their pleasure in that case. So it's worth keeping in mind the cultural difference of how reviews are used in the Chinese market versus the rest of the world, but also the fact that the way this was able to be figured out was that if you actually put the reviews in reference to language it was published in, Chinese is actually, or Mandarin rather, is actually the greatest in the negative space. And for those that are in English that are negative, they're mostly in relation to poor performance. So it's definitely worth keeping that in mind as we kind of, sit through and talk about it, which, yeah, I feel like there really isn't much to say about it. I think it's fair to assume that it's players that are actually complaining about the difficulty in English, are more or less trying to play with Guitar Hero controllers while blindfolded and counting in prime numbers while fighting the final boss at level 1. Like, that seems like such an incredibly specific yet extreme example, but that's kind of how people like to play Souls games, is to make things harder for themselves. And so if you're not actually partaking among the mechanics that are intended or that exist to make the intended experience easier, is kind of a fault on your own as well. So don't make things arbitrarily more difficult if you don't have to. But if you're complaining about difficulty and that's exactly what you're doing, then yeah, you kind of do deserve to be angry and upset if then the game is not playing ball with you, because you're not playing ball with its mechanics. You can't expect it to kind of just, you know, say, why aren't you leveling up or something along those lines. So it's just sort of small little bits and pieces. There really isn't much more to really say about it. I think majority of it is certainly the fact that the DLC is far more difficult than the base game, and that is also to be believed because that exact same thing happened with Bloodborne as well. But yeah, with all of that said, yeah, it's really just the Chinese audience that are having a difficult time because they're not able to get guides in their language. Whereas most of the English stuff is more about performance, and while some might not experience performance issues, not all PCs are created the same or created equal. So there is that as well. But let me know what you guys think about all of this in the comments below, about the overall design around difficulty, because while I think that difficulty can help a game, I'm not really a fan of it. It's kind of like me eating chilies as part of my dinner. Yeah, I can handle the spiciness, but the thing is, I don't really like the taste, or it doesn't really add flavor. In fact, it gets in the way of the flavor that I'm trying to consume within my food, so to speak. It's like a weird example, but it kind of hopefully gets the idea across that just because difficulty is there and it's nice for some people to have, some people would much rather not have that there, but that's all kind of in its own space. But specifically in relation to Erdtree and the Chinese audience not having guides for their specific language and things along those lines, and maybe just the general discourse around Soulsborne games as a whole. Would you actually play a Soulsborne game, or a Souls-like game, or a game just made by, well, like Dark Souls or something like that, if it was made a tad bit easier? Would that be something that you'd be interested in? Let me know about that in the comments below. Like the video if you liked it, subscribe to the channel. I'm aiming for 300 subs by the end of the year, and with all that said and done, I do upload every day, so I'll see you guys tomorrow.